In November of 1878, the air over the Dakota Territory had an edge like shattered glass. It was a dry, clean cold that promised a winter of unusual cruelty. Along the Gray Wolf River, the cottonwoods had long since surrendered their leaves, standing like skeletal armies along the banks. The river itself, the lifeblood of the region, was growing sluggish, its currents thickening with the first crystalline whispers of ice. For the 100 or so souls in the settlement of Northwood Bend, this was the season of final reckoning. Their town was a collection of sturdy, unadorned cabins perched on a high bluff, a sensible location chosen to escape the river's furious spring floods. But this safety came at a terrible price. The bluff was windswept and barren, the true wealth of the winter lands, the dense, sheltered stands of old-growth oak for firewood, the protected coves where deer and elk took refuge from the blizzards, lay a hard 10 miles upriver. Every autumn, a frantic race against the cold began. Men would boat upriver, fell as much timber as they could, and ferry it back, log by precarious log. They would hunt and smoke meat, hoping to stockpile enough to last until the thaw. It was a losing battle. A war of attrition fought against the coming ice. They never got enough. The journey was too long, the boats too small, the window of time too short. The first hard freeze always came like a slammed door, locking the resources away. Winter in Northwood Bend was not a season of peaceful rest. It was a slow siege, a gradual descent into hunger and cold. Families would huddle in their well-built but poorly placed homes, rationing firewood, then food, their existence shrinking to the few feet around a dwindling fire. The conventional wisdom of a permanent, rooted settlement was failing them, year after agonizing year. But that autumn, those making their last, desperate trips upriver saw something that defied all logic. They saw something that would become the talk of the town, the subject of ridicule, and ultimately, the seed of their salvation. 5 miles from the settlement, on a small, flat parcel of land near the richest timber cove, a man named Elias Thorne was building a house. This alone was not unusual. He was a relative newcomer who had bought the summer plot a few years prior. The strangeness was not in the walls he was raising. It was in the foundation he was not laying. Instead of sinking posts into the frozen earth, Elias Thorne was assembling his cabin atop 2 colossal, steam-bent oak beams. They were runners, skis. Each one was nearly 40 feet long, a foot deep, and smoothed to a craftsman's finish. They were curved gracefully upwards at the front, shod with a thin, dark strip of iron. The townsmen would stop their boats, drifting in the icy current, and just stare. He was not building a house. He was building a sled the size of a home. They saw a man preparing his family for a journey, but his house was the vessel. It was an act of profound, inexplicable madness. And in the taverns and general stores of Northwood Bend, the whispers began, soon turning to open laughter. They gave it a name, a title that dripped with the easy scorn of settled men for a fool's errand. They called it Thorne's Folly. The secret of what this man was doing, the quiet genius hidden within that strange house on skis, was a lesson that Northwood Bend was not yet ready to learn. They saw a man untethered from common sense, a man building a runaway house. What they couldn't see was that Elias Thorne was the only man in the entire valley who understood the true nature of their prison. And he was not building a way to run away. He was building the key. If you are already fascinated by this man's audacious project, by the sheer nerve it took to defy every known convention of construction and survival on the frontier, then do me a small favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories of quiet, determined innovation are worth sharing. And be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you do not miss our future explorations into the forgotten wisdom of the past. Let me know in the comments below. What is the most unconventional yet effective solution you have ever witnessed for a common, everyday problem? Because the principle behind Elias Thorne's colossal skis was more than just a clever trick. It was a revolutionary philosophy that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the settlers and their brutal environment. You are going to want to see exactly how he conceived of it, how he built it, and how it was put to the ultimate test. You are going to want to see how he did it. To understand Elias Thorne, you had to understand the river. Before he had ever tilled an acre of soil or swung an axe into a Dakota oak, he had been a man of the water. He was born and raised along the great arteries of the East, the wide, powerful rivers that served as the highways of a younger nation. He had not been a farmer or a carpenter in the traditional sense. He had been a builder of barges. He was a shipwright, though he would never have used such a grand term. His trade was not in the delicate, graceful lines of a clipper ship, but in the rugged, pragmatic construction of flat-bottomed vessels designed to carry immense weight. He understood stresses and loads in a way a house builder never could. A house builder thinks of a static load, a dead weight pressing straight down into unmoving earth. A foundation is an anchor, a symbol of permanence. But a barge builder, a man like Elias, thinks of a dynamic load. He thinks of a structure that must live, that must flex, twist, and absorb the relentless, shifting pressures of the water beneath it. He knew how to distribute the weight of 10 tons of cargo so that the hull would not buckle. He knew how to brace a frame not just against gravity, but against the torsional forces of a swirling current or the grinding impact of a sandbar. When Elias Thorne looked at a house, he did not see a fortress rooted to one spot. He saw a hull. He saw a vessel. This unique perspective was the lens through which he analyzed the central problem of Northwood Bend. He had lived through 2 of their winters, observing the slow, predictable tragedy unfold. He saw the flaw in their logic with the clarity of an outsider. The townspeople saw their problem as one of logistics, how to move enough resources from point A, the distant cove, to point B, their permanent homes. They attacked the problem with brute force, with aching backs and exhausted oxen, and they always failed. Elias saw the problem differently. He saw it as a problem of energy. It was a simple, brutal equation. Consider a man hauling a sled of firewood 10 miles over uneven, snow-covered ground. The friction is immense. The journey takes the better part of a day of relentless, calorie-burning labor in sub-zero temperatures. That man might burn 3,000 calories on the trip. The wood he brings back, when burned in a drafty, inefficient cabin, might provide a net thermal gain that barely justifies the effort, if it justifies it at all. Some days, when the wind was especially vicious, the journey to get the fuel cost more in bodily energy than the fuel itself could ever hope to replace. It was a thermodynamic trap. They were spending more to survive than survival was giving them back. They were slowly, collectively, starving and freezing, and calling it life. This led him to the second, deeper flaw in their thinking: the resource mismatch. The land on the bluff where the town stood was perfect for summer. It was safe from floods, it had good drainage for planting, and it caught the summer breezes. But it was a terrible place for winter. The true winter haven, the Timber Cove, was the inverse. It was low-lying and prone to flooding, making it unsuitable for permanent settlement. But it was nestled in a deep bend of the river, protected from the worst of the winds. It held the dense, dry wood they needed, and it was the natural shelter for the game that would see them through the leanest months. The people of Northwood Bend had made a permanent choice for a seasonal problem. They had anchored themselves to their summer solution, and in doing so, had chained themselves to their winter crisis. They had built their roots in the wrong soil for the season that mattered most. And finally, there was the sheer danger of their current method. The river was their only viable path for heavy hauling. In the autumn, men in small boats overloaded with logs would sometimes capsize in the freezing water, a near certain death sentence. In the early winter, they would try to cross on the first ice, a deadly gamble. More than one man had been lost, vanishing through a weak spot, his last cries swallowed by the wind. They were paying for their firewood with their lives. Elias Thorne's solution addressed all three problems with a single, elegant, and radical stroke. He would not move the resources to the people, he would move the people to the resources. His house on skis was the physical manifestation of this philosophy, and every component was designed with the precision of a shipwright, not a carpenter. The skis themselves, the runners that so amused the town, were his masterpiece. They were not just planks of wood. Elias had spent weeks selecting two perfectly straight, flawless oak trees. He and his oxen dragged them to a clearing where he had built a steam box, a long, insulated wooden trough fed by a boiling kettle. For days, he steamed the front 10 feet of each massive 40-foot beam until the lignin in the wood became pliable. Then, using a system of winches and a curved wooden form, he slowly bent the fronts upwards into that graceful, ski-like curve, a shape designed to ride up and over obstacles, not plow into them. Once they cooled, the wood held the shape permanently. He then laminated a second layer of hardwood onto the top for compressive strength and braced them internally. They were not sled runners. They were hulls, designed to glide. The final touch was the iron shoeing. He had the blacksmith in Northwood Bend forge long, thin strips of iron, which he painstakingly fastened to the bottom of the runners. He then spent days polishing them with sand and oil until they shone with a dull luster. He knew that the coefficient of static friction between polished iron and smooth ice was incredibly low. He was building a surface that wanted to move. The house itself was a marvel of structural engineering, completely alien to the construction methods used in town. The cabins in Northwood Bend were traditional log construction, heavy, solid, and immensely strong against downward pressure. But they were terribly weak against twisting forces. If you tried to drag a log cabin, the unbraced corners would rack, the chinking would crack and fall out, and the entire structure would tear itself apart. It was designed to stay put, and it would fight to the death to do so. Elias built his home using a braced frame technique he had learned from building barges. The frame was a skeleton of heavy timbers, joined with mortise and tenon joints, pegged with oak dowels. But critically, he added diagonal cross-bracing in every wall and across the floor joists. This triangulation made the structure phenomenally rigid against the exact kinds of torsional or twisting forces it would experience while being moved. The walls were not solid logs, but 2 layers of thick planks, one horizontal on the inside and one vertical on the outside, with a 3-inch gap between them. This gap, he explained to his wife Ilara, would be filled with sawdust from his work. It was insulation. It was a dead airspace that would make their small home vastly more efficient to heat than the solid, heat-leaking log walls of their neighbors. The entire structure was lighter, yet stronger, than a conventional cabin of the same size. Every piece of it was designed with movement in mind. The weight of the walls, the roof, and the floor was carefully channeled by the frame directly down onto the 2 main runners, ensuring a balanced load. It was, in every functional sense, a land-going vessel. Of course, the townspeople saw none of this. They saw a flimsy-looking plank house sitting on a ridiculous wooden sled. They saw a fool. Silas Croft, the town's master builder, was the most vocal critic. He was a man whose reputation was built on stone foundations and perfectly square log cabins that would stand for a century. He saw Thorne's work not just as foolish, but as a personal affront to the craft he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He would hold court in the general store,
his voice booming with authority.
"I tell you," he'd proclaim to the assembled men, "a house is meant to be a root. It draws its strength from the earth. That thing he's building, it's an abomination. A house with no foundation has no soul." The men would nod in agreement. It made sense. A house was permanence. It was safety. "Mark my words," Croft continued, jabbing a thick finger in the air for emphasis. "The moment he tries to move it, one of two things will happen. Either a team of 20 oxen won't be able to budge it an inch, and it will sit there and rot, a monument to his stupidity. Or the frame will twist, the floor will buckle, the walls will crack open, and it will collapse on top of his wife and child. The man is not just a fool, he is a danger to his own family." This public condemnation from the most respected builder in the region sealed Elias Thorne's fate in the court of public opinion. The project was no longer just a curiosity. It was Thorne's folly, a certified act of madness. The science behind his madness was simple and elegant. Elias had done the calculations in his head, the kind of practical mathematics a shipwright masters through experience. He estimated the total weight of his finished cabin, including furniture and his family, would be around 8,000 pounds, or 4 tons. It was a staggering weight. Trying to drag that much dead weight on a sled over bare earth would be nearly impossible. But Elias wasn't planning on dragging it over earth. He was waiting for the river. He calculated the surface area of his 2 massive runners. Each was 40 feet long and 10 inches wide. Together they provided over 66 square feet of contact surface. 8,000 pounds distributed over that area resulted in a ground pressure of a little over 80 pounds per square foot, or just over half a pound per square inch. For comparison, a man's boot print concentrated his entire weight into a few square inches, exerting a pressure of several pounds per square inch, enough to sink into deep snow. A wagon wheel was even worse. Thorne's house, as heavy as it was, would effectively float on the surface of packed snow or hard ice. It would not sink. Then there was the question of motive force. The force required to move an object is a function of its weight and the coefficient of friction of the surface it's on. The coefficient of friction between a wooden sled runner and bare ground is high. For iron on ice, however, it is astonishingly low. Elias knew that once he overcame the initial static friction, the force needed to get it moving, the kinetic friction to keep it sliding would be minimal. A single team of his 2 sturdy oxen, which would be utterly useless against the house on land, would be more than enough to pull it at a steady walk across the smooth, frozen highway of the Grey Wolf River. The river was not an obstacle to be crossed. It was the road he planned to use. The town saw a man building a house on a sled. Elias saw a man building a custom-designed vehicle, perfectly engineered for the terrain it would operate on. His wife, Alara, was caught in the crossfire. She was a practical woman who had learned to trust her husband's quiet competence. She had seen him build things others said were impossible back east. But she was not immune to the relentless pressure of the community. When she went into Northwood Bend for supplies like salt, flour, and coffee, she felt the stares. She heard the whispers that stopped abruptly when she turned a corner. The women would offer her pitying looks, asking if she was all right out there, with a tone that suggested she was living with a lunatic. One evening, as Elias was fitting the small, precious glass pane into their single window, she finally voiced the fears the town had planted in her. "Elias," she began, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Croft was in the store today. He was talking to everyone." Elias did not stop his work, carefully tapping the wooden pegs into place. "I imagine he was," he said. "He said the floor will buckle when we move. He said the walls are too thin, that they will not hold against the cold. He says the whole thing is a death trap." She wrung her hands. He is the best builder in the territory, Elias. What if he is right? What if we get stuck out here, halfway to nowhere, in a broken house, when the real cold comes? Elias finished his task and turned to her. He wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at her, his gaze steady and calm. He did not offer complex explanations of torsional rigidity or coefficients of friction. He did not dismiss her fears or rail against Silas Croft. He simply said, "This is not a house, Alara. Not like his. This is a tool. It is the right tool for this place. Have I ever built you a tool that broke?" She thought for a moment, thought of the clever well crank he had designed, the perfectly balanced axe handle he had carved, the sturdy, lightweight furniture that filled their home. She shook her head. "No," she admitted. "Then trust me," he said. "We will be warmer and safer in this death trap than anyone in that town. We will have a full woodpile and fresh meat while they are burning their chairs to stay alive. Just trust me." And she did. But the fear did not vanish entirely. It lingered, a cold shadow cast by the scorn of an entire community. Elias remained impervious. The mockery, the warnings, the pity, none of it touched him. He had done the math. He had worked the wood. He trusted the grain of the oak and the laws of physics more than he trusted the opinions of men who could not see beyond their own traditions. His response to their laughter was the rhythmic rasp of his planes smoothing the runners. His answer to their dire predictions was the solid, satisfying thud of his mallet driving another oak peg into his braced frame. He worked from sunup to sundown, a solitary figure moving with a quiet, unwavering purpose. He was not just building a house. He was building his argument, and he was content to let the winter be the judge. As October gave way to the iron-gray skies of November, the work was finished. The small, sturdy cabin stood complete upon its massive skis. A thin curl of smoke rose from its well-sealed chimney pipe, a sign of life and warmth. From the river, it looked impossible, like a child's toy grown to giant proportions. To the people of Northwood Bend, it was the final, tangible proof of Thorne's folly. The joke had been built. Now all that was left was to wait for the punchline, which they were all certain would be a tragic, splintered wreck. They did not have to wait long. The winter of 1878 did not arrive. It attacked. It came not as a gradual cooling, but as a sudden, brutal assault. In the second week of December, a weather system that would later be known as the Great Freeze descended from the Arctic. The temperature did not just drop, it plummeted. It went from a brisk 20 degrees to 10 below zero in a single night, and it kept falling. For 3 solid weeks, the mercury in the town's only reliable thermometer never rose above -20. At night, it sank to levels that had no name, levels where exposed skin would freeze in seconds, and the very air seemed to crackle. The snow came with it. A suffocating blanket of fine, dry powder that fell without end. It buried fences, then windowsills, then entire outbuildings. The wind howled off the plains and scoured the bluff where Northwood Bend sat, driving the snow into impenetrable drifts and sucking the heat from every crack and crevice in the log cabins. The world shrank to a universe of white and gray, a place of killing cold. The Gray Wolf River, which had been slowly icing over, froze solid with shocking speed. Not just a skim of ice on the surface, but a deep, profound freeze. The current, the river's very heartbeat, was stilled. It became a vast, silent expanse of gray, wind-blasted ice, in places 5 feet thick. It was no longer a river. It had become a road. a perfect, brutal highway of ice. In Northwood Bend, the siege Elias Thorne had foreseen began in earnest. The crisis he had predicted unfolded with terrifying speed and precision. The woodpiles, which had seemed adequate for a normal winter, vanished with alarming haste. The traditional log cabins, built by Silas Croft himself, were thermal nightmares. Their solid log walls, symbols of strength, were massive thermal bridges, constantly conducting the precious interior heat out into the Arctic air. Families stuffed rags into the gaps that appeared in the chinking as the logs contracted in the extreme cold. They burned wood around the clock, but the cabins were never truly warm. A small circle of survivable heat existed around the stove, while just a few feet away, in the corners of the rooms, water left in a bucket would freeze solid. The men who had laughed at Elias's thin-walled, insulated cabin now shivered in their own solid log tombs. They had built for strength, not for warmth. It was a fatal error. Soon the woodpiles were gone. The journey to the timber cove was now utterly impossible. The snow was too deep for the oxen, the 10-mile trek a suicidal undertaking in the face of the wind and the cold. Panic began to set in. Families started burning anything that would catch a flame: fence posts, spare furniture, old crates. The smoke from their chimneys grew thin and intermittent. A hacking cough began to spread through the town, the dry, rattling sound of pneumonia in the frigid, damp air. Silas Croft, the master builder, felt a gnawing responsibility. His houses, his pride, were failing his people. They were strong, yes, they would not collapse, but they were cold. They were traps. His own family was huddled around their stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, the temperature in their main room barely above 40 degrees. His reputation was turning to ash along with his hickory rocking chair. He was a man of action, and the inaction forced upon him by the storm was a torment. Meanwhile, 10 miles upriver, in the heart of the sheltered cove, life for Elias and Alara Thorne was starkly different. Their small, unassuming cabin was an island of warmth and tranquility in the midst of the frozen hellscape. The double walls, packed with 3 inches of sawdust, provided an astonishing amount of insulation. The small, efficient wood stove needed only a few logs at a time to keep the interior at a stable and comfortable 65 degrees. There were no cold corners, no drafts. The warmth was even, consistent, and required a fraction of the fuel being consumed in the town. Their location was their greatest advantage. They were not just near the fuel, they were living in the fuel depot. Every morning, Elias would spend a single, invigorating hour felling a dead oak or bucking up logs, never venturing more than 100 yards from his front door. He was not on a desperate, life-threatening expedition for fuel. It was a simple, daily chore. The rest of his day was spent indoors with his family, warm and safe. They had fresh meat, as the sheltered cove was filled with deer seeking refuge from the storm. They were not just surviving, they were living, and living well. Thorne's Folly was proving to be Thorne's fortress. Back in Northwood Bend, the situation turned from dire to desperate. The town doctor, a grim, exhausted man named Alistair Finch, went to Silas Croft. His words were blunt. "Silas, 2 children have died. Old Man Hemlock is not far behind. We are out of wood. The town is freezing to death. If we do not get a supply of fuel, and soon, we will be burying families come the thaw." The words struck Croft like a physical blow. He was the town elder, the master builder. This was his failure. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He knew there was only one place to go, one last, desperate gamble. The timber cove. He gathered a small group of the strongest remaining men. It was a mission of desperation. They took 2 teams of oxen and a large sled, a grueling, near-hopeless journey. For 2 days they fought their way upriver, not on the ice itself, which was too windswept, but along the banks, battling through monstrous snowdrifts. The men were frostbitten and exhausted, the oxen near collapse. It was a slow, punishing crawl through a world of white. On the evening of the second day, they finally broke through into the relative calm of the sheltered cove. They were near the end of their strength, half frozen and demoralized. And then they saw it. Through the swirling snow, they saw a pinprick of warm, yellow light. It was a window. As they staggered closer, the shape resolved itself from the gloom. It was a cabin. A small, neat cabin with a steady, confident plume of smoke rising from its chimney. It was Thorn's Folly. They watched, dumbfounded, as the cabin door opened. A man emerged. Elias Thorn. He was not bundled in rags, but wore a simple wool coat, his movements unhurried. He walked to his 2 oxen, which stood calm and healthy in a small, wind-protected lean-to. He began to hitch them, not to a sled, but to the front of the house itself, where a massive iron ring was bolted to the frame. Silas Croft and his men stood frozen, hidden by the trees, witnessing the impossible. They watched as Thorn gave a quiet command to his animals. The oxen strained, their muscles bunching. There was a deep, groaning sound from the house, the sound of immense friction being overcome. The massive structure shuddered, and then, with a smoothness that defied all of Croft's understanding of physics and carpentry, the house began to move. It slid forward, off its earthen winter berth, and onto the smooth, snow-dusted ice of the frozen river. It did not twist. It did not buckle. It glided. Elias walked alongside, his hand resting on the wall as if he were leading a docile beast. The house moved with a slow, inexorable grace down the frozen highway. Silas Croft stood there, the brutal wind whipping at his face, and he did not feel the cold. He felt a heat rising in his chest, the heat of a lifetime of certainty being burned away in an instant. Everything he knew, everything he had preached about foundations and roots and permanence, was a lie. He had mocked this man. He had called him a fool and a charlatan. And now that fool was gliding past him in a warm, solid home, the master of a brutal world that had brought Croft and his entire town to their knees. He was not witnessing a folly. He was witnessing a miracle of practical genius. He was witnessing the answer to all their prayers, an answer he had tried to shout down. The journey downriver was a slow, triumphant procession. Elias Thorn was moving to town. He guided his house with an easy skill, keeping to the center of the river where the ice was thickest and the surface smoothest. Behind the house, he had hitched a large cargo sled, piled high with a surplus of split oak firewood. He was not just saving his own family. He was bringing salvation to the town that had ridiculed him. The arrival of Thorn's Folly at Northwood Bend was a silent, momentous event. The townspeople, drawn from their freezing homes by the strange sight, lined the edge of the bluff. They watched as the house on skis glided to a halt on the river flats below the town. There was no splintered wreck, no collapsed frame. There was only a solid, warm-looking home, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its chimney, parked neatly as if it had always been there. The laughing had stopped. The whispers had died. There was only a profound, stunned silence. Elias unhitched his oxen and calmly began to unload the firewood from the sled, stacking it on the bank, making no move to approach the townspeople. He simply did the work that needed to be done. One man broke from the crowd on the bluff and made his way down the steep path to the river flats. It was Silas Croft. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, shame, awe, and a deep, burgeoning respect. He walked not to Elias, but to the house. He ran a hand over the vertical plank walls, marveling at their solidity. He knelt and examined the junction where the frame met the massive runners, seeing the clever bracing he had been unable to imagine. He saw the work not of a fool, but of a master craftsman from a discipline he had never known. Then he turned and walked to Elias Thorne, who stopped his work and waited, his expression unreadable. The entire town watched from above, waiting to see what their leader, their expert, would do. Silas Croft looked Elias in the eye. His voice, when it came, was not the booming, confident tone he used in the general store. It was quiet, humbled, but it carried clearly in the still, cold air, loud enough for all on the bluff to hear. "Thorne," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong." He paused, letting the weight of the admission settle. "I told them all you were a fool. I said this thing would be a death trap. I was the fool." He gestured back up toward the cold, dark cabins on the bluff. "I built them houses, strong houses. But you built them a future." This public recantation, this complete and total surrender of ego from the town's proudest man, was the moment of Elias Thorne's true vindication. It was more powerful than any argument, more convincing than any blueprint. The expert had admitted his error. The old way was broken. A new way had arrived. That act broke the spell of pride that had held the town. Men swarmed down the path, not with anger or suspicion, but with a desperate, hopeful energy. They helped Elias unload the rest of the wood, hauling it up the bluff to the families most in need. The immediate crisis was averted, but a deeper, more profound change had just begun. The rest of that winter, Thorne's house on the flats became a school. Men who had once mocked him now came to him, hats in hand, not to ridicule, but to learn. They came not as critics, but as students. Silas Croft was the most dedicated of them all. He spent hours with Elias, studying the braced frame design, understanding the principles of insulation and weight distribution. He applied his own decades of building knowledge, suggesting small refinements, ways to strengthen the joints or improve the window seals. It was a collaboration between the old wisdom and the new, a fusion of tradition and innovation. Elias, for his part, was a patient teacher. He held no grudges. He saw their newfound interest not as a personal victory, but as a practical necessity for the community's survival. He freely shared his designs, his steam-bending techniques, his knowledge of runners and rigging. He explained the physics in simple, practical terms they could understand. He taught them to see their world not as a fixed and static battlefield, but as a dynamic environment with its own rules that could be used to their advantage. When the spring thaw finally came, and the gray Wolf River broke free of its icy prison, Elias Thorne moved his house back upriver to his summer plot. But this time, his journey was not a spectacle of folly. It was a demonstration of a proven technology. That summer, the sounds of construction in Northwood Bend were different. Alongside the familiar work of repairing roofs and fences, a new industry was born on the river flats. Under the joint supervision of Elias Thorne and a humbled Silas Croft, 3 more winter houses were built. They were not identical copies, each incorporated small improvements. Croft, with his mastery of traditional joinery, found ways to make the frames even more rigid. Another man, a former wheelwright, devised a better braking system for the runners. The idea was evolving, adapting to the skills of the community. By the time the first snows of 1879 began to fall, Northwood Bend was a transformed settlement. 4 mobile homes stood ready. When the river froze solid, a small, planned migration took place. The families moved their winter homes up to the timber cove, creating a small, seasonal satellite village. They spent the winter in warmth and plenty, with easy access to fuel and game. The main town on the bluff became a quiet, semi-deserted summer capital. They had learned to move with the seasons, not to fight them. They had learned to be a current, not a stone. The long-term impact was profound. The annual winter death toll in Northwood Bend, which had been a grimly accepted reality, dropped to 0 and stayed there. The community became healthier, more prosperous, and more resilient. The story of Thorne's folly, now told as Thorne's genius, spread through the territory. Trappers and traders carried the tale to other remote settlements facing the same deadly paradox of being anchored to the wrong seasonal location. The concept of the skid shack, or the river sled home, began to appear in other frozen valleys, a piece of practical wisdom born from one man's refusal to accept a flawed tradition. Elias Thorne's innovation was not just about building a house on skis. It was a fundamental shift in perspective. He introduced the idea of adaptable, mobile architecture to a people obsessed with permanence. He taught them that the greatest strength was not in being unmovable, but in having the wisdom to move to where life was sustainable. His legacy was written not in stone foundations, but in the tracks his house left on the winter ice, the tracks that led an entire community from the brink of extinction toward a secure and prosperous future. It was a testament to the simple, powerful idea that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to build a home that knows how to travel. The story of Elias Thorne and his house on skis is more than just a clever tale of frontier survival. It is a powerful lesson in the tyranny of conventional wisdom. A house is a root, the experts said, unable to see that the very thing they praised as a strength, permanence, was the direct cause of their suffering. On a frontier that demanded flexibility, they had chosen to be rigid. In a world that moved with the seasons, they had chosen to stand still. They were trying to be oak trees in a landscape that rewarded the willow. Elias Thorne saw things differently. He possessed a clarity of vision that came from an outsider's perspective, the perspective of a shipwright who understood that a structure could be both strong and mobile. He did not see the frozen river as a barrier. He saw it as a highway. He did not see his house as a static anchor. He saw it as a dynamic tool, a vessel designed to carry his family to safety and abundance. True innovation, the kind that changes the world, often looks like madness to those who are trapped in the prison of the way things have always been done. It is the ability to question the most basic assumptions that separates the visionary from the crowd. This story is a powerful reminder of how one person's quiet determination and radical vision can change everything for a community. If you found this piece of forgotten history as fascinating and inspiring as I did, I would be honored if you would hit that subscribe button and join our community of learners. And please, drop a comment below. I read every single one. My question for you today is this: what modern, seemingly unmovable problem in our own world do you think could be solved with a radical shift in perspective, just like Elias Thorne's house on skis? Please remember, this story is a fictionalized account intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The characters and specific events are products of imagination, but the engineering and survival principles are based on historical practices. The construction of any dwelling, mobile or otherwise, must be done in accordance with modern building codes, local laws, and with the consultation of qualified professionals. Do not attempt to replicate historical building techniques without ensuring they meet today's safety standards.